I've been sort of building this argument for 3 years and feel like where I started out is quite different from where I ended up. I'm going to begin here with a couple of quotes, and this stuff a lot of you will be able to identify with this kind of stuff. We're reading it all the time. Here's a quote that I ran across recently. Millennials are the loneliest generation. 1 of 5 millennials report they are lonely and have no friends. And then like a week or two later, I saw study reveals Gen Z is the loneliest generation in America. And then to sort of summarize this general viewpoint, which was essentially my own view, Gene Twenge, Gen Z, quote, Gen Z spends less time with their friends face to face and more time online and on social media. As we know from decades of research, people who interact with others face to face are less likely to be lonely. Recent research suggests that those who spend more time on social media, in contrast, are more likely to be lonely. So that's sort of the state of the argument as I saw it really at the beginning of this 3-year project. And if you look at my 3 years sort of sketched out here, you'll sort of see the development. The first year, I basically was arguing that friends need embodiment and reciprocity, and that online friendship is a kind of sham friendship. So I just sort of took this brutal position and tried to argue it as hard as I could. I was inspired in part from watching my son develop these online friendships and worrying about him. And I think that's probably true for a lot of us. But then the second year it's not a volte-face, but it's a kind of a change of direction where I began to see that pro-social emotions can develop without mutual reciprocity. And that was surprising to me. So friendship has a therapeutic profile that can be replicated with non-humans, inanimate objects, social robots, and even celebrities. And so this made me think, I'll come back to this in a moment, but it made me think, oh, you know, friendship doesn't have the high bar that I thought it did. And notions of bonding and intimacy really come, or the feelings of bonding and intimacy can come with a much lower threshold of reciprocity. In fact, you can have no reciprocity and still feel like you're in a meaningful relationship. And then this year, what I want to do is sort of turn in a slightly different direction, digital intimacy in the age of social distancing. So COVID has dramatically reduced embodied social interaction for everybody. So in year one, it was really a sort of a small population that I was worried about. Now I think we're worried about everybody. And friendship then should be worse off, according to the sort of embodied theory of friendship. But then the question is it? And I want to sort of turn optimistically in a way and argue that if we reconsider language, we're going to find some optimism here. So in order to make this argument, let me back up and just establish some of this you're going to be familiar with and some of it will be new. But embodied cognition is really the sort of approach that I'm coming from. And from that view, you can see that people have had, over the last 14 months or so, a kind of skin hunger, a touch hunger, and a face hunger. We really feel like we miss people's faces and touch of our relatives and friends. Obviously, it's getting better now with the vaccine. But this reveals something that affective neuroscience has known all along, which is that there are these affective or emotional mammalian systems. In other words, below our psychology is a layer of physiology that's happening. And so everybody gets this if you talk about something like lust or fear. We know that in lust, there's a dopamine rise, norepinephrine, testosterone, and estrogen. But lesser known, although equally sort of corroborated by robust studies, is that there is a care or bonding system for human beings, just as there is for all mammals. This is underwritten largely by oxytocin and endogenous opioids like endorphins. And so if you see here, loneliness is a form of separation anxiety. It's a withdrawal from a healthy social addiction of endogenous opioids. So we literally crave our friends and family. Unlike other addictions, of course, this one is good for your health. But this is a point that I think is not well appreciated. Like people talk about being addicted or face hunger, and they think it's a metaphor, but actually it's not a metaphor. It's literally the case. I refer you to some, because of time constraints, I refer you to the really principal researchers on this, people like Larry Young, Jaak Panksepp, who was one of my teachers, Seth Pollack, Jennifer McIntosh, Zuo-Shin Wang. There's a lot of great work on this. I want to talk more specifically about, what's the evidence that I think we can relate to immediately of bonding success and failure. Many studies have been done on these sad cases where children are raised entirely in an orphanage in war-torn regions where they don't have the basic kind of touch of a caregiver. And the result is that the oxytocin endogenous opioid system never gets primed. It's sort of a little bit like Chomsky's language theory in a way, because you've got to activate the sort of genetically engraved program in order for it to kick in. And if it never gets sort of activated, then you end up with adults who have attachment disorder. There's a lot of evidence from not just human natural experiments, but also animal studies. And then here, to summarize, touch deprivation can lead to health issues like anxiety and depression. And this is Tiffany Field, director of the Touch Research Institute at University of Miami. I want to just throw this slide in here real quick. Don't worry, we're not going to go through this in detail, but I think it's important to also not lay sort of all of our problems at the doorstep of technology, nor even should we lay them at the doorstep of social isolation, as bad as that is. I'm inclined to the theory developed by Douglas Watt and Jaak Panksepp of a mismatch theory of depression and anxiety. In other words, our genomes are living in an alien environment. You and I, our genes basically evolved for an original evolutionary environment, and it's quite different from modern environments. So we would have had enormous amounts of aerobic exercise, and now we have none. We would have had 8 or 9 hours of sleep, and now we're lucky if we get 6. We would have had occasional calorie limitations, which turns out to be fairly healthy for you. And now we have unlimited calories. And we can go down this whole list. Here at number 12, I've included, we would have had intimate social groups and tribes, and now it's very difficult to attain or maintain that stuff. It's not all bad now, because it's kind of worth mentioning is your mortality rate then would have been 35 to 45, whereas now you get to live to be around 75 or 85, depending, And so maybe living this long, anxiety and depression is the cost. All right, so back then more to the topic, which is what about digital social life and levels of embodiment? And of course, social media like email, messaging, meme sharing, that's going to be fairly low levels of affective or embodied immersion. Now, Zoom and FaceTime have intermediate levels because we can see each other. And I think all of the objections that Beverly raised, notwithstanding, you can hear my voice, I can see when you're laughing, you can see my hands moving. There's a lot more embodiment happening in this way. Console and app gaming, again, intermediate levels, and then enhanced reality and virtual reality have fairly high levels of embodiment because you're actually moving the whole body together in a group. All right, so then this got me thinking, and you may recall last year I did a little hover on this, what I'm now calling the Wilson paradox. Always name your ideas. The Wilson paradox, a friendship without reciprocity. And this again struck me as strange, but now I've been living with it for a couple of years and been doing more research into what's called parasociology. And so I was calling this as if bonding, sort of after Hans Weinger, but it's the kind of stuff that we looked at last time, which is that social robots turn out to be very therapeutic for people. Social AI actually produces feelings of warmth and bonding in people on more than trivial numbers. More radical cases are the objectophiles. I'm thinking of bonding here like a bell curve. And if you think about sort of typicality at the middle and atypicality at the ends, then objectophiles are people who feel like they've fallen in love with an object. And there's some fairly famous cases of this but it appears to be legitimate. And then something way more common is parasocial relationships with celebrities. And I've been looking at this literature over the last year, and it's fascinating. People feel that their own identity and their emotional and psychological well-being are intimately tied up with, if not an actor, sometimes a fictional character that's being played by an actor. And so that's a remarkable level of non-reciprocity that still seems to be doing a lot of good for someone's life. Now, we can argue this later. And then also some other examples, virtual therapy seems to work for many people. If you just unburden yourself through a kind of narrative story to an AI that gives you these kind of prompts, believe it or not, there's a non-trivial number of people who feel better after this. And then finally, perhaps more controversially, this may be at the heart of religion. Even if you think religion is true, that you still have to acknowledge that it's deeply therapeutic to talk to someone who doesn't usually talk back to you. Okay, notwithstanding the occasional cases where they do. I think of the Stevie Wonder song, Have a Talk with God, where he says, well, God is the only free psychiatrist. And then he says, when you feel your life's too hard, just go have a talk with God. I sort of refer people to the work by Tanya Luhrmann on this, and this is non-trivial kinds of therapeutic results from just talking to someone that you hope is reciprocating, but you really don't have a whole lot of give and take with. All right, the sort of explanation of the Wilson paradox that I came up with was that one, there's a kind of pre-scientific mythopoetic cognition. And this is an argument I've been working on the side, and I have a Target article coming out on this in the Evolutionary Studies of Imaginative Cultures journal. So this is kind of a bigger topic, but I think just to put it in a nutshell, I believe that human beings primarily are mythopoetic or narrative thinkers first, and only sort of literal thinkers much later in the development, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. And so this is important because it means that we still retain this way of thinking about trees and rivers. We think in animistic ways, and we think about our technology, like my little robot that vacuums. And I remember in Berkeley, we were all sort of wanting to pet the little food delivery service robots we were seeing cruising around on the streets. In any case, I also think that if you're familiar with Martin Buber's I, thou, I, it distinction, you'll recognize that this is a way of attuning yourself to not just to other humans, but possibly the natural world too. And then secondly, what I already suggested was that we have a pre-adapted mammalian emotional system of attachment or care. We know that this can be manipulated by animal studies. It works the same in us. And these two things together provide us the ability to bond with stuff that doesn't have a lot of reciprocity. But now we're living in, a pandemic and spending a lot of time on Zoom. And like others, I myself formed a strong friendship entirely online, much to my shock and surprise. And I thought, how is this possible? Because everything I've worked on suggests that you need embodiment. And clearly it was a real friendship. And so it led me to think, well, either my theory is wrong or I need to tinker with the theory. And like any good academic, I'm going to tinker with the theory. So what I want to talk about today is a theory of language that actually rescues this kind of Zoom relationship in a way that I had not seen before. It made me rethink language dramatically. Now, this is a bit confusing, and just bear with me. I'll take us through this in some detail, but let me just sort of prepare you for this slide with a quick reading, which is that the people that have been working on embodied language, some of these people, you'll recognize their names. They're coming from different quadrants. Robin Dunbar out of anthropology and biology, my own dissertation advisor, Mark Johnson Lakoff, you remember, worked a lot on metaphors we live by. Barbara Tversky has been working on this for decades, and her new book is out. Lawrence Barsalou. But all of these thinkers sort of converge on the idea that when you perceive something like a lemon, so if you look at this image here, this is my drawing of a lemon, just work with me, people. And then this is my, a hand being sort of poked here. Let's stay with the lemon. When you perceive a thing like a lemon, many modes of perceptual memory will be stored and then activated later by other triggers, including language. The word lemon creates a reverse flow of associations, affects, and memories, from abstract word to concrete perceptual information. And that's a reversal of the original experience, which is sensual first and symbolic or linguistic later. Language is a reversal activation of embodied information, or feeling states. Language is a kind of virtual reality, a trigger of the simulation system. So there can be shared experience. Since language reactivates the embodied pathways directly, it does not stand like a digital code or a map of experience. It is part of experience itself. And here I'm talking primarily about spoken language and conversation. So if we look at this kind of drawing, you'll see that this is the way you record your information about a lemon: perception, affective or emotional states, cognitive architecture, motor responses. All of this basically creates memories, which are implicit and explicit, semantic and episodic. This stuff is coded, by the way. It's not just morphological memory of a lemon. It's going to be all the perceptual stuff with somatic coding about feeling states, whether you want to approach or avoid the thing. And then this basically leads to the language layer, which is, going to be metaphorical and analogical first, and I think indicative and descriptive words sort of last. Now, what happens is when you tell somebody a story, so now you're A telling this story to B, you basically reverse your way through this pathway. So the language and metaphor and analogy and storytelling are literally recreating all of those memory states and perceptual states within your listener, all the way back to B's original experiences. So that's what it means to have an embodied theory of language. It means that knowledge itself and meaning is a simulation theory. So let me just sort of state this again. Simulation theory of meaning, basically, which has been confirmed by things like mirror neurons, somatic markers, is basically the idea that language is embodied feeling. That is in contrast with the entire history of the philosophy of language, which says that language is a representational theory. And according to that view, language just refers to feeling states. Let me take two on this, and then this sort of section maybe is a little more fun. There's something vaguely Harry Potter-esque about this, but I was thinking about this and I came up with a metaphor, which was, imagine that the language is like a map. And in this case, it has representational power like a map, but imagine if your map also has little parts of the territory itself within it. So imagine a map of Chicago, and in the place of the John Hancock building, there is a little piece of the John Hancock building. And where Lake Michigan is drawn, there's a tiny wet area of Lake Michigan water. This is important because most linguistic theories, whether it's like Saussure or Hilary Putnam, they foundered on the question of how the word or the symbol tethers to the referent. This is why you're always deferring verification. This is sort of why Derrida talks about a difference. But on the simulation view of language as embodied map, the semantic content of the word lemon just is the embodied pathway, the affective states, the feelings, the imagery, the affordances. So this is a view of language as biosemantics. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about this hilarious Lewis Carroll story, sort of late in his career, where he tells a story of these Germans who've made a map, and they start out with like 1 inch of the map represents a mile, and then then 6 inches on the map will represent a mile. And then eventually they have a map which one map on the mile represents one map in reality. And then the joke is they can never open the map. But even that map is still a representational map. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a simulation system, which is a different view. So now, what does this mean to our experience in digital world? Here are some examples of non-representational knowledge. This is how the simulation system works. You use it all the time. You stick your tongue out at a chimp, he will stick his tongue out at you. If you ever see the haka dance in New Zealand, you will feel like punching the snot out of somebody because it will rile you up so dramatically. Dancing is a simulation system. Babies simulate mothers, early technology, and so on. And what I didn't really realize until this year was that partly because I was spoiled by, decades of training in philosophy. But what I didn't really realize was that language itself needs to go in this group. It is not an outlier. It's really part of this simulation system. And I know I need to be winding down here, and I'm mindful of that. So there's a lot more to say, but I'll try to bring it all together a little bit and conclude. There's a lot of confirmations of an embodied language theory. There would be no trigger warnings if embodied language wasn't real. In order to protect those with trauma from having a linguistic spark give flame to a full embodied pathway, you know, we basically, that's a realization that language is experience. Robin Dunbar's theory, who I mentioned before, talks about the evolution of language. Early on, language did not evolve to describe things like science does. It actually evolved to groom other human beings. So language is actually a form of touch. Motherese, for example, where everyone sort of talks to babies in that sort of style, it's a kind of attenuated touch that's designed to soothe or rile up the child. Evidence of telling my story is really crucial for developing a sense of self. I talked about that. And then the other example, which I've worked with Paul Giamatti on this, is that art really does trigger the actual emotions via contagion. So when the actor is actually embodying an emotion and having it, you in the audience are not referring to those emotions. You are actually catching those emotions by contagion. And there are failures to deploy the simulation system. We know that there are cases in Asperger's, and then a very different kind of psychopathy fails to employ the system. So, all right, let me bring this to a close. There's a lot more to get to, but I think where I'll end is just to ask this question at the end, which is, I had this sort of chicken soup test, which was, how do you know how loyal your friends are? Are they willing to bring you chicken soup on a, you know, at a moment's notice when you're sick? Because that requires them to burn calories. And that I'm trying to think of what are ways in which you have to demonstrate loyalty. In the end, then the question still remains, is online life, social life, faux bonding, number one, 2, reduced bonding, or 3, full bonding? At the beginning of the study, I was saying it's faux bonding, and now I'm convinced it's just reduced bonding. And so that's a good place to sort of draw the formal comments to a close, and I will sort of end there. Thank you.